The land stretched wide and merciless, a horizon painted in fire and dust, where silence was deeper than prayer, and every gust of wind seemed to carry the sigh of forgotten souls. It was here, on the barren edge of the world, that I had chosen to bury myself. My name was Silas Vance, and for a decade I lived like a shadow against the Black Mesa, a man who had traded laughter for solitude, hope for regret, and company for cattle whose dull eyes asked for nothing but grass and water. My days bled into one another, mending fences, boiling coffee too bitter to comfort, and walking past the same scarred walls that stood not as home but as a tomb for the man I once was. The nights were worse, for in the hush of stars I could still hear the echo of a treaty broken, a promise betrayed, and a family slaughtered while I stood powerless, shackled not by rope but by cowardice. A man does not heal by hiding, though I tried. Every sunrise over the desert reminded me not of beginnings, but of endings. I had turned my back on progress, on justice, on the very notion of honor, yet honor clung to me like a wound that refused to scab. Healing is a strange companion. It does not arrive soft and gentle, but through storms, through the voices of the past that wake you in the dark and remind you that silence is not peace, it is punishment. I lived inside that punishment willingly, believing it safer to rot slowly in obscurity than to face the weight of what I had failed to protect. But even in exile, the world has a way of finding you. It does not matter how far you ride from men or how tightly you nail your door against memory. One cry in the wind, one echo of pain, can break a decade of walls. And so I stayed restless on that hard land, walking its gullies, mending its troughs, never knowing that fate was leading me back to the edge of a story I thought had ended long ago. You who listen now may feel the same, carrying wounds time did not close, living among ghosts you never invited. I tell you this gently, healing is not found in the silence you build, but in the fragile voices that break it. Sometimes love arrives not as a song, but as a storm that forces you to rise. If these words ease even a little of your own burden, let your heart rest here a while. And if you find warmth in this story, a simple gesture can keep it alive. Leave a like, share a comment, subscribe so this campfire of stories does not burn out in the cold. For in sharing, we are less alone. The desert was not finished with me. On a morning carved from dust and silence, when the air itself seemed brittle enough to break, I heard a sound no man living in solitude expects, a cry, sharp and human, splitting the stillness of Rattlesnake Gulch. My hand went to the worn walnut stock of my Winchester before my thoughts caught up, my pulse heavy with a rhythm I had sworn never to hear again. And trouble had come, and with it a chance, perhaps the only one left, to prove I was not the wall of failure I had built around myself. It was the beginning of a tale not of solitude, but of fire, of redemption, and of a woman whose presence would change everything I believed about love and survival. And with that sound, I turned toward the gulch, into the unknown that waited. The cry that split the desert air carried a weight sharper than any blade, and as I spurred Dusty forward, each hoofbeat hammered against the brittle silence like a drumbeat, pulling me out of exile. The gulch opened below me in a violent tableau, splintered wood, a wagon shattered on its side, and the cruel shadows of men bent to wicked work. Their leader, Barton Thorne, stood tall and wiry, the sneer on his face as permanent as a scar. His eyes were cold, not from lack of warmth, but from calculation, as if cruelty was the only arithmetic he trusted. And then I saw her. She was tangled in the wreckage, a small body wrapped in buckskin, her dark hair spilling wild across the dirt, her arm pressed to her side where blood had soaked the fabric through. She was Comanche, a daughter of the very people I had once promised to defend, a promise I had failed with every breath since. Yet her eyes, when they met mine from across the broken wagon, were not begging. They were burning, defiant, furious, alive. That gaze struck me harder than any bullet could, because in it I saw what I had lost and what I might still find. My rifle steadied, not at her captor's hearts, but at the axle of the wagon. One shot rang out, splintering wood and silence alike. It was a warning, a declaration, a line drawn in the dust that none of Thorne's men dared cross. "Leave her!" I roared, the sound ripping from my chest like thunder rolling through canyon walls. Thorne's grin twisted, venom in his voice, as he called me the ghost of Texas, mocking the man I had become. Yet when my second shot kicked up dust between his boots, even he flinched. He saw in me not a broken hermit, but the wall I had once been, and still could be. With curses and promises of vengeance, he rode off, abandoning his injured companions and the bleeding woman who had already stolen the marrow of my silence. I descended into the gulch, every step measured, my rifle still raised against the horizon. Her breath came shallow, ragged, yet her eyes followed me with steady fire. I bent to lift her, and though her body trembled with pain, there was strength in her silence, as if she refused to give Thorne even the victory of a groan. I carried her against my chest, her blood warm through my shirt, and for the first time in years, the weight I bore was not of guilt, but of purpose. Healing began in that moment, not only for her broken body, but for my soul, starved too long of redemption. The ride back to my cabin was slow, every mile a fragile gamble against death. She sagged in my arms, her breathing shallow, yet each faint exhale against my chest kept me tethered to life as surely as the reins in my hand. When at last the cabin door swung open beneath my boot, I laid her gently on the cot, the only bed in my barren kingdom, and lit the lamp with fingers steadier than I remembered having. My tools were crude, whiskey for fire, needle for flesh, linen torn from my own shirt, but my hands worked as if guided by something greater than skill. Her moans tore at me, yet each stitch, each bandage was a vow. She would live, and I would not fail again. Through the long hours of that night, I watched her fight between breaths, her silence more powerful than any scream. The cabin that had known only the echo of my own solitude now carried the rhythm of her fragile life. Healing is not always gentle. It burns, it scars, it humbles. Yet, as I sat in the wooden chair beside her bed, rifle leaning against the hearth, I felt the silence change. No longer a tomb, it had become a vigil, a sanctuary where two broken souls had collided. Outside, the desert wind carried whispers of Thorne's threat, but inside, by the flicker of firelight, a fragile bond was born. I poured bitter coffee into a tin cup, tasted its black edge, and swore silently to the land itself, "She will not die here. I will see her safe." For the first time in years, the weight of my loneliness shifted. In saving her, I had already surrendered my solitude, and perhaps, just perhaps, I had found a reason worth keeping. The dawn crept pale across the mesa, brushing her face with light. Her eyes flickered open, dark as winter skies, steady as the earth itself. No words passed between us. None were needed. In that gaze, I felt the wall I had built begin to crack, and through the cracks, something warm, something living, began to take root. I did not know her name, yet already she was the voice in my silence. And as the sun climbed, I understood with fierce clarity, Thorn would return, and when he did, I would stand, not as a ghost, but as the man I was always meant to be. And so the story moved forward, into fire and trial, into the healing touch of trust, and into the storm of love that waits where danger and redemption meet. The days that followed her arrival in my cabin stretched like threads pulled tight between silence and survival. At first she spoke nothing, her lips pressed closed, as if words themselves might spill more blood. Yet her presence filled the small wooden room in ways I had not thought possible. Before her, the cabin was orderly, predictable, lifeless. A stack of firewood, a scarred table, one cot by the window facing the mesa. Now, though she lay still and fevered, her shallow breath became the second rhythm of the place, the sound of existence mingling with the crackle of the hearth. Even the air felt different, softened by the weight of her presence. It was no longer the silence of punishment, but of healing, fragile and uncertain, yet real. Each morning I washed her wounds with boiled water, pressing cloth to her ribs with the care of a man terrified of breaking what little remained unbroken. My hands, scarred and calloused from ranch work and gunfights long past, found a gentleness I had forgotten I owned. When her fever surged, I sat by her side through the night, spooning broth into lips barely parted, whispering words I never thought I'd speak aloud. Steady now. Breathe. The worst will pass. Perhaps she did not hear, but I needed to say them, needed to remind myself that even the most broken man could still offer comfort. Healing is not always the stitching of skin. It is the quiet presence of someone refusing to leave when the world insists you are alone. On the third night, when fever burned hottest, she stirred and whispered something low in her own tongue, words that brushed against the air like a prayer. I did not understand, but I felt them like the desert wind threading through canyon stone. In that moment, I realized her silence was not emptiness. It was a shield, holding back a world that had already stolen too much. I did not ask her for thanks. A man does not pull someone from death's edge for gratitude. You do it because your soul demands it, because the alternative is a weight you cannot bear. By the fourth morning, her eyes found mine with a steadiness that startled me. They were sharp, watchful, like stars through smoke. She studied me not as savior or captor, but as one measures a storm, quiet, dangerous, perhaps useful. I found myself returning her gaze longer than I should, not flinching from what I saw there. For the first time in years, another human being looked at me without pity or dismissal, only recognition. It was as though she saw not only the man I was, but the man I had tried so hard to bury. The cabin itself shifted beneath this new rhythm. Where once there had been the brittle stillness of exile, there was now an undercurrent of life. Her breath, the rustle of bandages, the soft clink of tin when I poured water. All these sounds wove together into something fragile and sacred. Healing is not swift, nor is it simple. It is made of these small cadences, repeated, until they teach the soul to trust again. And in her silence, I found a mirror. She carried wounds deeper than mine, yet her spirit refused to break. That stubborn will breathed warmth into the walls I had built, and for the first time I wondered if solitude had been a prison, not a sanctuary. One dawn, as the fire died low, I caught her watching me. Her eyes lingered, not in fear, not in accusation, but in something quieter, curiosity, maybe even trust. I did not speak. Words would have shattered the delicate balance between us. Instead, I poured black coffee into my tin cup and sat by the window, rifle leaned against the hearth, keeping my vigil. The desert stretched wide outside, yet the true vastness was here, in this cabin where two broken lives had collided. But healing never comes without trial, and the desert does not forgive softness for long. On the morning I thought the worst had passed, when her breathing had steadied and I dared to believe she might live without danger, I heard it, the slow groan of wood on the porch, the whisper of a bolt sliding back into a chamber. Trouble had returned, carried on the breath of Barton Thorn. The cabin held its silence one last time, heavy as judgment, before the storm broke. And as my hand reached for the rifle, I knew this was no longer about solitude or penance. It was about her, about the vow I had made when I carried her from the dust. The fight was coming, and for the first time in a decade I was ready to stand, not as a ghost, but as a man who had found something worth protecting. The floorboards of the cabin whispered beneath unfamiliar weight, a sound too careful, too predatory to belong to anything honest. My hand slid to the rifle where it leaned against the hearth, and my breath quieted until I could hear the drum of my own heart. Outside, the morning light carried no warmth, only a thin grey veil, as if the sun itself was holding its breath. She stirred on the cot, her eyes opening with the sharpness of instinct. Before I could lift the weapon, I saw her trembling hands already wrapped around it, steady despite the blood seeping through her bandage. She had risen from weakness with the resolve of someone who had lived her whole life on the edge of ruin. Her body betrayed her pain, yet her gaze was steady, fixed on the door, as if she knew the storm waiting beyond it. And then came the sound, low, guttural, not the bark of a dog, but the thunderous growl of a beast that had no need to warn. Barton Thorn's voice followed, high and cruel, a man who delighted in theatre. He called for me to step out, promising ruin if I did not. He had brought a bear to my doorstep, chained but raging, the embodiment of his twisted belief that cruelty was strength. The cabin shook with the force of its breath, the boards trembling as though they feared what was to come. She held the rifle tighter, her eyes flicking to me with a mixture of fear and fire. I saw her ribs heave with each ragged breath, the fever still clinging to her, yet she stood like a sentinel against the dark. I placed my hand over hers, gently lowering the barrel. "Listen," I murmured, my voice soft, the way you speak to a wounded horse that still has thunder in its veins. "When I open that door, you go to the back. Crawl, if you must. Find the trail and keep running." Her head shook violently, anger and disbelief flashing across her face, as though she had heard such promises before from men who failed to keep them. But I had no time to argue, no words sharp enough to carve through the mistrust branded on her life. My record would be written in action, not alibis. The dynamite stick weighed against my ribs, a desperate gamble I had pulled from the barn, as if some old voice had warned me of this moment. A man can fear fire, or he can learn to wield it. I struck the match with a thumb, the sulphur burning bright in the dim cabin, and I knew this choice would scar the day forever. The door creaked open, and the bear's breath surged in, thick and foul, followed by Thorn's mocking laugh. In that instant, I saw everything as if carved into stone. Her pale face at the window, the shadow of Thorn's grin outside, the chain straining against the beast's fury. I hurled the dynamite low, not at the man, not at the beast, but at the ground between them, the mean little world they shared. The explosion tore through the morning with a violence that bent the earth itself. Dust, splinters and smoke filled the air, the cabin groaning under the assault. The bear roared, a sound that rattled bone, and I heard the ring of metal break, chain or collar, I could not tell. Thorn's shout twisted into rage and fear, and chaos swallowed the yard. I did not wait to see which devil won. My hand found hers, fingers tight but tender, pulling her toward the back room where the last unbroken window waited. Together we stumbled through the shards of glass into the bitter air, the desert wind sharp with dust and smoke. I lowered her gently to the ground, shielding her ribs with my arm as we ran bent double along the wall. The noise behind us was a storm of claws, curses, and gunfire, but in front of us lay only the thin thread of survival. She kept pace despite her wounds, her small body burning with stubborn resolve, and each step beside me became not a retreat but a vow. Healing is born in fire as much as in tenderness, and in that moment, fleeing death, I felt the fragile seed of trust take root between us. We reached the arroyo, its dry bed offering a cloak of shadow, and slid into its sandy gut. The world above shook with violence, yet down there in the cool earth we caught a breath, however brief. She pressed her hand to her ribs, the blood seeping through, and though her body trembled, her eyes met mine with unbroken light. The desert had given us no mercy, but in her gaze I found something stronger than hope, the certainty that we would endure together. We moved deeper into the ravine, every step a fight against exhaustion, yet every heartbeat a proof of survival. Behind us, Thorn's wrath hunted, but ahead stretched the unknown, a place where healing might finally have room to grow. And as I guided her through the shifting shadows, I knew the desert had bound us in a covenant far greater than vengeance, one of blood, fire, and the first quiet stirrings of love. The arroyo carried us like a shallow river of dust, its curves hiding us from the men who surely searched the horizon. Each step was a labor, each breath edged with smoke still clinging from the dynamite's thunder. The land gave us no kindness, only its brutal honesty, the scrape of shale beneath boots, the thorns snagging at cloth, the sky burning down without a trace of mercy. She stumbled once, twice, but caught herself each time with a quiet refusal to yield, her hand pressed tight against her ribs as if she could keep her spirit from spilling out into the sand. I stayed close, guiding her with a steady arm, feeling the heat of her fever against my skin. Together we moved not as captor and rescued, not as strangers, but as two souls bound by necessity and something unspoken, fragile as the desert wind. When her strength faltered, I lifted her into my arms. Her weight was slight, but the responsibility heavier than iron. Her breath warmed my neck, shallow yet determined, and in that warmth I felt a strange healing begin, as if her fight to live was mending pieces of me I had long abandoned. The canyon walls rose around us, ancient and red, offering shade at last. I laid her beneath an overhang, the sand cool as silk compared to the blistered trail behind us. She pressed her palms into the earth, grounding herself, as though asking the land for strength. I gave her the canteen, and she drank with discipline. Sip, pause, sip again, then pressed it back into my hand with a look that said she would not take more than I could spare. That small gesture humbled me more than any battle. We ate little, strips of jerky that felt like dust on the tongue, but it was enough to remind the blood to keep flowing. I tore cloth into bandages and wrapped her ribs tighter, my hands careful, reverent. She winced, but her eyes never left mine. In them, I read a question, unspoken. Why do you care? My answer came not in words, but in the gentleness of my touch, in the vow carved into every motion. I will not let you fall. Healing is built this way, thread by thread, through trust earned in silence. Night came sharp and sudden, the desert air dropping into a cold that bit deeper than steel. I gave her the blanket, pulling it over her shoulders, and sat close enough that my body heat bled into hers. She did not move away. Her breathing slowed, steadied, and as the stars scattered silver across the sky, she leaned lightly against me, her weight both fragile and anchoring. I listened to the soft cadence of her breath, the rhythm of life that only hours before had nearly been stolen. For the first time in years, I felt peace, not in solitude, but in presence, her presence, the warmth of another soul beside mine. Through the following days, we walked and rested in turns, finding shelter in caves, shade beneath cottonwoods, and life in the trickle of hidden springs. She showed me plants that soothed fever, bitter leaves that eased thirst, and cactus fruit that bled sweet water when crushed. Her knowledge of the land humbled me, and I learned to follow her lead, trusting the wisdom carved into her bones by generations who had survived this unforgiving place. Each step we took together bound us tighter. When I faltered, she pressed a hand to my arm, steadying me with quiet strength. When her legs gave way, I carried her, whispering words that were less command than prayer. We became each other's crutch, each other's reason to keep standing. In her silence, I began to hear not emptiness but resilience, the echo of someone who had endured betrayal and still chosen to live. And in my watchful care, she began to see not a ghost of broken promises, but a man struggling to become whole again. Healing does not come in grand gestures, it arrives in these moments. A shared sip of water, a steadying hand, a glance exchanged when words would only break the fragile trust. One dusk, when the mesa cast long shadows and the wind carried the scent of rain that never came, she spoke her name at last. "Nara," she said, her voice raw, yet strong enough to carry truth. "It means the light." I repeated it, letting the syllables rest on my tongue, a vow in themselves. In naming herself, she gave me more than a word. She gave me a tether, a reason. The desert felt less empty with her name in the air. The journey stretched on, harsh and unrelenting, but with each mile I no longer felt like a man fleeing death. I felt like a man walking towards something, redemption perhaps, or love. The horizon no longer mocked me with silence. It beckoned, painted in fire and dust, promising that the story was not finished. And as the canyon walls closed behind us, I knew Thorn's shadow still hunted, but we carried with us something he could never chain, the fragile, growing light of two wounded souls daring to heal together. The path into the hidden canyon felt less like a trail and more like a passage carved into the marrow of the earth itself. Walls of stone rose around us, crimson and gold in the sun, their weight ancient, their silence deep. Each step was an offering, each breath a prayer that we might finally find refuge. My body trembled with exhaustion, my shoulder burning from the wound that refused to mend, yet her presence kept me upright. Nara walked ahead, light-footed despite the pain she carried, her dark hair lifting in the desert wind like a banner of quiet defiance. I followed, not just because she knew the way, but because she had become the compass of my broken life. When at last the canyon widened into a place of shade and water, I saw them, her people, the Comanche. They stepped from the stone like shadows given form, their eyes sharp, their faces carved by years of surviving betrayal and fire. Spears, bows, and the watchful silence of warriors greeted me. In their gaze I felt the full weight of history, the knowledge that I stood not as guest, but as ghost, a man whose kind had brought them grief and blood. My hand twitched toward the rifle at my side, not to draw it, but to resist the instinct to shield myself. I had promised Nara I would stand, and so I did, every muscle taut as a bowstring. An elder stepped forward, his face lined like the cliffs themselves, his voice rough with authority. "Why do you bring this man here, Na Skywalker?" he asked, his words heavy, unyielding. She moved to stand between us, her small frame a shield stronger than any wall I had ever built. "Because he saved me," she said, her voice clear, her ribs still bound in bloodied cloth, yet her spirit unshaken. "Because he risked his own life for mine. He is a man of honor." The elder's eyes burned into me, searching, measuring. "Honor," he spat, as though the word were ash. "A white man's honor is a shadow. It flickers, it lies, it vanishes when the wind turns." His judgment was not cruel, only weary, as though he had seen too many promises break like dry twigs. I felt the old instinct rise within me, to defend myself with pride, to argue, to shout my truth. But Nara's quiet strength held me still. Pride had failed me before. Only honesty could stand now. I stepped forward, leaving the safety of her shadow. My voice came low, steady, though my knees trembled. "I do not ask you to believe me. I have failed before, and I will fail again. I have seen good people die because of my silence, because of my weakness. I carry that weight every day, but I saved your granddaughter not for glory, not for coin. I saved her because I could not bear another broken promise. If you wish my life as payment for the sins of my past, take it. But know this, I am no longer the man who turned away. I am a man who will fight for what is right, even if it costs me everything." Silence fell like stone between us. The warriors shifted, their eyes narrowing, their hands flexing on spears. But the elder, rising sun, held my gaze for a long, unbroken moment. He saw no polish in me, no easy charm, only a man raw with regret, yet steady with resolve. At last, his shoulders softened by the smallest measure. "You may stay," he said, his voice still rough as gravel, "but you will be watched. Trust is not given in a day." It is earned in the years that follow. Nara's hand found mine, a quiet press of gratitude, her warmth anchoring me against the chill of so many suspicious stares. In that touch, I felt more healing than in a decade of solitude. We entered the canyon together, where stone towers cast deep shadows and water sang in hidden streams. For weeks I lived among them, watched by eyes sharp as blades. At first, I was treated as an intruder, a reminder of scars they wished to forget, but slowly the rhythm of life began to shift. I learned their ways, not as a child eager for stories, but as a penitent listening for forgiveness. Nara showed me the herbs that drew fever out of flesh, the songs that stitched courage into weary bones, the traditions that had kept her people alive despite the cruelty of the world. At night, by the fire, I listened to their laughter, the quiet prayers whispered at dawn, the stories carried in the faces of the children who slowly dared to approach me without fear. And the weight I had carried for years began to ease, not by vanishing, but by being shared. Healing was not erasing the wound, it was learning to live with it, to let it breathe without festering. Nara moved among her people with a strength that left me in awe. She was no victim, no fragile flower. She was a survivor, a healer, a light in the desert's unrelenting dark. Watching her, I understood more than I could speak, that love is not loud, not burning like the dynamite I had thrown. It is quiet, steady, like water carving stone, patient enough to change the shape of a man's soul. The Comanche began to call me something new, the wall who stood. At first, I thought it mockery, but in time, I realized it was respect, a name for the man who had chosen not to run, who had faced cruelty with resolve. I wore it with humility, with the understanding that titles mean nothing if not proven each day. And so the canyon became more than refuge. It became a place of rebirth. The rifle at my side grew lighter, not because the world was safe, but because my heart had learned another weight, the weight of belonging, of love, quietly blooming where once there had been only silence. I had not found redemption in solitude. I had found it here, in her gaze, in her people, in the healing that comes when two broken lives dare to lean on one another. Yet shadows lingered, for the desert holds grudges, and Barton Thorne's hatred was not buried beneath the explosion at my cabin. His name drifted on the wind, whispered in dustfall, sharpened by lies meant to cut deeper than knives. He would return, and when he did, we would face not only his guns, but his poison. But I no longer feared the storm, for beside me walked Nara, the light that turned silence into song, and in her strength I had learned my own again. Together we would meet whatever darkness came. Dustfall waited at the edge of the horizon like a wound that refused to close, a town built from greed and fear, its streets lined with false laughter and hungry eyes. By the time we reached the ridge that overlooked it, my body was half a ruin, my shoulder raw, my breath shallow, yet Nara's presence beside me made each step bearable. She walked with quiet certainty, the desert wind threading through her dark hair, her gaze fixed not on the danger below, but on the truth we carried with us. Healing had already begun between us, fragile but undeniable, and now it would be tested in the heart of a place that thrived on broken souls. We knew Barton Thorne had spread his poison ahead of us. His lies painted Nara as a traitor, a woman who had led soldiers to her people's winter camp years before. His story crafted to turn her own against her. The bounty on her head was doubled, not only for her capture, but for her name. That was his greatest cruelty, not the pursuit of her body, but the theft of her honor. When I saw the fire in her eyes as she spoke of it, I understood that this battle was not mine alone. It was hers, and I would stand beside her until the truth was carved into the very dust beneath our boots. Little Fox, her uncle, had already scouted the edges of town. He told us of Thorn's growing army, men gathered with coin and fear, their hands ready for violence, but their hearts brittle. Yet even in Dustfall, not all were blind. There were miners cheated of wages, women branded with bruises, children orphaned by the cruelty of men who had no law but their own. Hope was buried deep, but it still breathed. And so we formed a plan, not with armies, but with honesty. At noon, when the bell of St. Agnes tolled, the town itself would hear what had been hidden. Proof, witnesses, voices that had long been silenced would be given the chance to rise. The morning of the reckoning was pale and grey. The sun veiled as though the sky itself waited to see if Dustfall would choose justice or sink deeper into its own rot. Nara stood at my side in the narrow alley, her ribs bound tight, her blouse plain, her hair braided with a strip of red cloth that caught the light like a flame. She did not tremble. Her stillness was the kind born of storms survived, of betrayals endured. When her hand brushed mine, it was not a plea but a promise that we would face this together, no matter the cost. We stepped into the street as the bell began to toll, its clang harsh and uneven, yet somehow holy. People turned, first curious, then wary, as they saw us take our place beneath the shadow of the gilded cage saloon where Thorn liked to hold court. One by one, others joined. Stella, the saloon girl with eyes steady despite the bruise fading on her jaw. Alvarez, the teamster who remembered too much. Milo, the stable boy whose rope-burned hands clenched with courage he didn't yet know he possessed. They came because silence had grown too heavy to bear, because even the most frightened soul reaches for healing when truth is finally within reach. Thorn appeared as if conjured by the bell itself, his scarred face stretched in a grin that dripped contempt. He spoke with false ease, his voice oily as he called us liars, traitors, fools. He mocked me as the ghost of Texas, mocked Nara as the winter girl, his words sharp enough to cut if we had no armor. But armor does not always come from steel. It comes from conviction, from the shared strength of those who refuse to bow. And when Nara stepped forward, her voice steady, her hands unshaking, the street fell silent. She spoke not in anger, but in truth. She told the story of that winter, of the camp betrayed, of the boot print with a notch in its heel, of the mark Thorn always scratched when boredom gnawed at him. Her words were not loud, yet they carried like fire through dry grass. Unstoppable. The clerk came forward with the ledger, the pages inked with sums and lies too heavy to ignore. Alvarez added his voice, the weight of his memory pressing down on Thorn's schemes. Stella showed her ring, the pawn ticket bearing the same cursed mark. One by one, their truths layered together until the crowd could no longer pretend not to see. It was not our guns that shifted the balance, but their voices, rising as one against a man who had fed on their silence. Thorn's grin faltered, then curdled into rage. He reached for his pistol, but my rifle was already steady, the barrel aimed not at his chest but at the ground between us, daring him to test whether the town still belonged to him. The silence that followed was thick, pulsing, until the sheriff, once timid, once absent, stepped forward, his voice trembling but firm, as he declared Thorne under arrest. The weight of the badge, meaningless for so long, suddenly grew heavy in his hand, heavy enough to bind even a tyrant. The people closed in then, not like wolves, but like a tide. The current of their will left Thorne no place to stand. His lies cracked beneath the weight of witnesses, his cruelty shattered under the gaze of those who had finally remembered their strength. They chained him, dragged him not to triumph but to justice, and for the first time in years, Dustfall breathed like a town reborn. Through it all, Nara stood beside me, her eyes luminous, her face calm, as though she had known all along that truth would find its way. When the crowd dispersed, when the dust settled, she turned to me and touched my hand, light but sure. "You stood," she whispered, and those 2 words were healing enough to quiet every ghost I had carried. We walked away from Dustfall as the sun slid low, painting the sky in crimson and gold. Behind us, the town had chosen a new name for itself, one built not on fear, but on voices rising together. Ahead of us lay only the open road, uncertain, dangerous, but ours. And as her fingers laced with mine, steady and warm, I knew that whatever storms still waited, I would not face them as a ghost. I would face them as a man reborn, with love at my side. The desert wind carried us forward into the promise of night and the fragile dawn beyond, where healing and love would grow, not in silence, but in the shared song of 2 souls who had found each other in the dust. The days after Dustfall unfolded like a long exhale, a release neither of us had dared believe possible. The desert, once a place of punishment, began to feel different in its silence, as though the land itself had acknowledged what had been broken and what had begun to mend. We rode slow, our bodies still carrying the memory of wounds, my shoulder stiff beneath its bandage, Nara's ribs bound tight, yet every movement was easier because we carried each other. The road stretched empty ahead, but for the first time, emptiness did not mean loneliness. It meant possibility. We camped beneath cottonwoods by a narrow stream, the water cool and singing over stone. At night, the stars spilled like silver dust across the sky, and in their light I saw her face softened by rest, her breath steady, her lips parted in the fragile rhythm of sleep. I watched her in silence, not with hunger, but with reverence, as if she were a prayer the desert had granted after too many years of drought. She stirred once, turning toward me, her hand brushing against mine, and even in sleep she clung, not out of fear, but out of trust. Healing lives in those small gestures, in the warmth of skin against skin, in the quiet knowledge that neither heart will face the night alone again. By day she guided us through the land as if it were an old companion. She knew the places where shade lingered past noon, the springs hidden in the folds of stone, the fruit that could quench thirst when water ran thin. Her knowledge humbled me. I had lived in this country a decade and still treated it as enemy. She walked it as kin, and in teaching me, she softened my edges. I began to see the desert not only as hardship, but as teacher, harsh, yes, but also healing in its truth, a place where only what is strong and honest survives. And I realized that was what she had done for me. She had turned me from a man rotting in solitude into one who could learn, one who could love again. We spoke more with each passing day. At first it was simple: water, fire, rest. But soon it became memory. She told me of her childhood, the songs her mother sang, the laughter of cousins in a winter camp before betrayal tore it all away. I told her of the rangers, of the friends I lost, of the weight I carried from the family I had failed. She did not flinch from my shame. Instead, she listened, her eyes steady, her silence filled not with judgment, but with something gentler, something that made the words feel less like confession and more like release. In her presence, I found healing I had not known I needed, and in my steadiness, she found the space to grieve aloud, to let her pain breathe instead of burying it. One evening, as firelight painted her face in amber, she reached for my hand. "We are both scarred," she whispered, her voice rough yet tender. "But scars do not mean weakness. They mean we healed." I turned her hand in mine, tracing the faint marks that told stories even she did not share, and I thought of the canyon walls, carved by centuries of wind and water, beautiful not in spite of their scars, but because of them. I bent and kissed her fingers, slow and reverent, and for the first time in a lifetime I allowed myself to believe that love could grow even in soil this barren. When her lips finally touched mine, it was not a blaze, but a warmth that spread through me like the steady glow of coals, a fire meant to last. Her breath carried the scent of sage, her body leaned fragile yet fierce against mine, and the world fell away until only we remained. That kiss was not just love, it was survival, it was forgiveness, it was a vow. And in its healing, I felt the ghosts of my past step back, no longer demanding penance, but granting peace. We did not speak of forever, because forever is a promise too heavy for those who know the cruelty of the world. But we spoke of tomorrow, and the day after, and the roads still waiting. Together we would walk them, not as fugitives, but as companions, not as haunted souls, but as two people who had chosen each other against every cruelty fate had thrown their way. The desert wind carried our laughter across the stones, softer than prayer, stronger than grief. And in that laughter, I knew. Love had not only returned to me, it had remade me. If you have felt the weight of this journey, if the healing and warmth of this story touched even a corner of your heart, let me know by leaving a like, sharing a comment, or subscribing. Every gesture helps keep these Wild West love stories alive, so that no soul has to ride through the silence alone.